So I'm going to talk about a little bit about company buy-to-lets today, but this is just some fine print. We are solicitors at the end of the day, so don't take anything for granted. Anything in here is just general guidance. That's just about me and the firm. Right, so company buy-to-lets. There's pros and cons to investing in a company, investing through a company. Martin has covered this numerous times with examples as to when it would be good to buy through a limited company, when it would be good to buy through an individual, as an individual. The decision largely is a tax exercise, so it's something that Martin would have to cover as to what would be best given your particular scenario once a full fact find has been done. What I'm going to talk about today is simply the legal process and some of the jargon, so we can drill down in some of the jargon and see what is entailed in company buy-to-lets. So the first thing would be to set up the limited company. Now, you can either set up what is called an SPV company, which is a special purpose vehicle company, which is specific to that property, or you can use an existing company that you've got with several other properties. Again, that would be a taxation exercise, and so discuss with your accountant, with Martin first, as to whether you should set up a new company or whether you should be buying it through an existing company. The costs of running a company are quite high, so it may not be as easy a decision. You have to consider all of the costs that are involved and the hassle of going through a new limited company for each property. There's also something about a debenture, which I'll come to in a minute, which will also determine whether you should buy through an existing company or through a new company that you would set up. Company purchases are very, very common now, designed largely to get around the Section 24 tax changes. There's several lenders. In the past, company mortgage rates were very, very high, but now, as Laura has said, that they've come down quite a bit, and they're very, very affordable. The main lenders that we come across are the Mortgage Works, which is still one of the main lenders that does company buy-to-lets, along with Together Finance, Aldermore, and Precise, who are again very, very prominent in this market. Consider bridging as a short-term solution, especially if you are going through auction. And again, there are several lenders like MT Finance we come across quite a bit who are doing a lot of company buy-to-lets. And I've underlined short-term solution because bridging can be quite expensive. So again, just sort of have your exit strategy lined up before you go ahead with that. One thing you should check is whether your solicitor is on the panel, because that can greatly impact on the fees that you're going to pay. So if your solicitor is on the panel, and that would largely be the case with most mainstream lenders like TMW, like Aldermore, where your solicitor will act for you as well as for the bank on a joint instruction basis. So you're effectively, the solicitor has got control from both sides, so it makes the process a lot quicker, but also the costs are kept to a bare minimum as much as possible. If your solicitor is not on the panel, such as Together Finance or some bridging companies where they have to use another solicitor, where the solicitor can't act on both sides for various reasons, and I can go into that if you want. But certain companies like Together almost always will appoint another firm to act for them, and your solicitor will only act for you. That greatly increases the fees. It adds time because there's yet another set of solicitor that's involved that has to go through this whole process all over again. So when you're doing your costings as to whether you should buy through a company or through an individual, keep these costs in mind because they all add up. Next slide, please. If you like Chris Whitty, doing that. Over. So I thought we'll talk about some of the documents that we come across in company buy-to-lets. One of the things that comes across is a debenture. Now, obviously, you have a legal charge that will go against the property itself, but in addition to that, some lenders take what is called a debenture, and a debenture is effectively a floating charge that covers all of the assets in the company. So it may not necessarily sit on the property itself. The property, in addition to the property, it'll cover any other assets that are within the property as well. So again, that should be one of the considerations when you're looking to consider whether you should buy in a new company or whether you want to buy through an existing company. Because if you have 4 or 5 unencumbered properties in the existing company, by giving a debenture, you're automatically giving them a charge over all of those properties as well. So be careful when you're going with the debenture as to which company, how the transaction should be structured. TMW, for example, usually don't ask for a debenture. Other lenders do ask for a debenture, so just know your lender, know what the requirements are. and then that should form the basis of how you structure your transaction. The other thing that, again, was mentioned before was personal guarantees. So when you are buying through a limited company, a company's liabilities are limited to the assets within the company, which means that the lender can't get more from you than whatever the company owns. So the exposure to risk with the lenders is quite high because of that, where if the market was to tank, for example, and the property prices were to drop, they would be exposed to risk. So to get around that, what they do is they ask for personal guarantees from the individual directors who are the directors behind the company. Now, almost always that will be the case where they'll ask for a personal guarantee, but you might want to consider whether you want to give that. You might want to consider whether the company itself is sufficient as a legal entity to provide enough security for the property that's being mortgaged. If there are 3 or 4 unencumbered properties within the company, why does the lender want a personal guarantee? Why do you want to put your home online for the lender? You know, why do you want to do that? So again, consider those things. You might want to ask for a limit on the guarantee. So you know, if it's an open-ended guarantee, for example, you might want to say, actually, my limit is no more than 50 grand or whatever it is that you want to put down. So have a think about the personal guarantee and how it impacts you personally, because it takes away the benefit of the limited liability structure to an extent, because it opens you up to personal unlimited liability. Pre-COVID, so lenders will always insist that, because the company is a separate legal entity to the directors, lenders will always insist that the directors appoint a separate solicitor and get independent legal advice before they sign up to the personal guarantee. Before COVID, almost always they would ask you to go and see a solicitor face-to-face, get independent legal advice. Since COVID, they have become a bit lax and they will go with advice given by Zoom. So that has made things a little bit easier because you have a variety of people that can do that. But again, be aware of the additional costs, which again, I think we should have checked our presentations first because we've kind of overlapped quite a bit. But be aware of the costs that are involved. Again, goes back to doing the costings and making sure whether all this is worth going down the company route. Other documents that you will come across will be the board minutes authorizing the purchase through the company. Officer's certificate will be a director giving a certificate saying the purchase is authorized and the charge is authorized. A further winding up search that will be needed to make sure the company is not being wound up. And finally, the charge itself has to be filed with Companies House within 21 days of creation of the charge. And if you miss that charge, you have to go to court to get a court order, no exceptions. And again, that's all sort of, a faff on really. So that's it on company buy-to-lets really from me. Is there anybody who has any questions on this before I move on to leaseholds?
Are you referring to, when you talk about the finance, are you referring to buy-to-let or are you referring to commercial lending?
Buy-to-lets. Buy-to-lets. I'm talking about company buy-to-lets only here.
Because a lot of what you're explaining here also refers to tertiary lenders.
Yes. That's right, that's right. So debentures and things like that would overlap and that would generally fall within commercial as well. But a lot of the company buy-to-lets also insist on that. So TMW is the main lender, they don't insist on it. They don't ask for debentures, but other lenders do. So it does fall into that. Even for buy-to-let mortgages, they are asking.
Is that becoming a bit of a norm now?
Almost always they'll ask for personal guarantees on buy-to-let mortgages. Even TMW will. So almost always that will be the case. And you could probably fight it off with, where your mortgage is individually arranged with somebody like Together, you could probably fight it off. But whereas an off-the-shelf mortgage product like, a Lloyd's Bank or whatever, that's their requirement. It's almost take it or leave it. So yeah, it's with company buy-to-lets, not just commercial. Okay.
Do you get a better rate of interest if you give a guarantee?
Do you get a better rate of interest, Laura, if you give a guarantee?
On the buy-to-let, no. On buy-to-let stuff.
It's a standard thing that you are supposed to give it. I don't think that impacts on. They won't proceed without it.
We didn't have to give a guarantee at all.
So again, if your company itself is a sufficient credit standing, or they consider the company as good enough, as a suitable security, they may not do that, and you may be able to fight it off with certain lenders, or put a cap on that guarantee with certain lenders. But if it's a
just as an aside, in my particular case,
yeah.
I would have given the guarantee if I got a better rate, so to speak. But if
Yeah,
I mean, it was in the low threes,
right.
or mid threes, I can't remember exactly what it was, but
Hmm.
I mean, that's what it was, so you have to sort of agree to it.
That may well be the case, that you can get a better rate if you are giving a guarantee. Great. So I thought we'd talk about leasehold properties a little bit. The legal world moves very slowly, so there's not a lot in terms of updates, and not a lot has happened. But there are one or two major changes that have come in that I thought I would just mention here. Everybody knows unacceptable ground rents on leasehold properties. Lenders are very, very strict on this now, where escalating ground rents or ground rents that go over £250 an annum, or have a potential to go over that amount because of a rent review within your lease, are not accepted to most lenders. What are escalating ground rents? Escalating ground rents are rents that multiply every so often. So if rents go up, say, starting rent is 200 quid, going up every 10 years, and it doubles every 10 years, that is called an escalating ground rent. And for a while now, lenders don't allow those sort of ground rent provisions within leases. And that's the reason why this is an issue. Firstly, because having a higher rent increases the value of your freehold. So when you come to extend your lease, you are having to pay a lot more in terms of premium. So that's the first thing, that the value of the freehold should really be a nominal value, but it increases the value if you've got a high rent. The other really important reason why leases over 250 or ground rent over 250 are not acceptable is number two there, that one of the things that the Housing Act 1988 says, that if your rent goes over 250, then regardless of what you call that, it's actually an AST. So even if it's a leasehold property that you've paid a lot of money for, you paid a premium for, it automatically becomes an AST, because Housing Act does not make that distinction that actually ASTs only really apply to rental properties. It doesn't apply to these sort of properties. So if your rent is over 250 in the northeast or anywhere outside of London, or it's over, or if it's over £1,000 within London, then it automatically becomes an AST. The consequence of that is that if your tenant, or if you as a tenant are late by 8 weeks, and you go to the court and the landlord takes you to court and says, I want possession, the court does not have discretion. They have to grant you possession for that. So effectively, that security of tenure that leases have is taken away because of that. So it's a really, really important issue, because if the lease is over 250, then it brings it into the realms of becoming an AST, which clearly it's not. So for that reason, lenders won't allow any leases that are over 250 because of that kind of interaction with this particular law. The good news is that this Act of Parliament, which has been going through for a long, long time, has now received royal assent. It's called the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Bill, which received royal assent last month. But yet, the date when it goes live has not been decided. It will be decided at a future date. So even though it's an act of law, it's not in place yet. And the crucial thing is that it only applies to new properties. It doesn't apply to existing properties. So it doesn't actually solve the issue that we have with existing leasehold properties. So what does the Act do? It limits the ground rent to a peppercorn. So any new leases that are now being granted after this date, when this Act comes into force, any new leases that are being granted can only be granted with a peppercorn rent. They can't have ground rent that's more than that. And there's also a prohibition on charging admin charges to get around that as an anti-avoidance measure. And this particular act is being defined as part of the most significant changes to property law in a generation, because, as I say, the legal world moves very, very slowly, so not a lot has actually happened. So it doesn't help with the existing properties, unfortunately.
Surbhi, on that,
Mm-hmm.
if you're extending the lease, will it affect that on the new lease that you extend?
So if the new lease, depending on whether you're going down, how you're going to down, and that's what I'm going to cover, the statutory and the voluntary extension. But depending on how you extend it, if it's a new lease that's been granted, so it's a surrender and a re-grant, once the old term has ended, then the sort of the new part of it, the new extended term, will be on a peppercorn rent. But that's the proposal. So it hasn't happened yet. It's simply a proposal. It's not, the details are not out, but that's the proposal, that once the original term has ended, the new term will be on a peppercorn rent. Okay? So anybody that has leasehold property chances are you will at some point need a lease extension, unless it's a 9-year lease, which is way, way, way down the line. beyond our lifetimes. So if it's a 99-year lease that you started off with, you might think, actually, that's way down the line, I won't need to worry about it. But the problem, as we know, is that as soon as you get to the 80-year mark, it becomes extremely expensive to extend a lease at that point, because they add something called marriage value in the calculation of the premium that bumps up the cost of extending a lease. So because of that, the lenders will insist that when you're mortgaging a property, you have to have at least 85, some lenders even ask for 90 years remaining. So if you bought a lease with 99-year initial term and you've got about 90 years remaining, chances are you now need to think about extending that term already. Okay? And the premium can often be quite a big cost, and again, it's not deductible from your rental income, so it's a capital expense, so you have to be aware of that. And often we get asked about how do we go about extending the leases. So I thought I would just cover this very briefly to say there are two ways in which you can extend your leases. One is a voluntary extension, which is where you agree the terms with the freeholder. The freeholder either doesn't want a premium, or the terms of the premium and the new lease are voluntarily agreed with the landlord. So you ring up the landlord and say, I want lease extension. Landlord says, okay, give me $5,000 and I'm happy with that. You then say, okay, that's fine, I'll go ahead with that. That's the terms agreed. There's no correlation between the value that you're paying and the value of the lease that you're extending. It's simply a figure plucked out of thin air that both parties are happy with. Okay? And often we see that with Tyneside flats, where both flats up and down need extending at the same time. So there's no point, given that the other guy is your freeholder and you are the freeholder of the upstairs, the premium effectively cancels out for both leases, so you don't necessarily pay a premium. So in those cases, always best to go down the voluntary route first, explore that, and if it doesn't work out, then you've got a statutory option to renew, because as a leasehold property owner, you have a right under Leasehold Reform and Common Hold Act 1993, which basically says that you have a right to renew a lease, extend a lease by paying a premium. Now that is a much longer process. It's a costlier process because there's more notices to serve and things like that. So what we always say is explore the voluntary route first. If that doesn't work out, then go down the statutory route. Sometimes people down south, a lot of the times people down south go straight to statutory because they're generally more contentious people down south, whereas up here we tend to be more accommodating. So for whatever reason, up here it's generally always voluntary, down south is almost always statutory. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure, just on the voluntary one,
Mm-hmm.
so Southside flats, we've got the voluntary at the moment.
Yeah.
Is there rules around, I know you said it's agreed between the board, but in essence, if it's £2,000, then someone's paying £2,000 to receive £2,000 back.
Yeah.
Does that payment actually have to be made, or would you say the payment's £5,000?
Are you talking about North Tyneside or South Tyneside?
South Tyneside.
So there's just the one lease.
No,
So
sorry, it's not Tyneside.
North Tyneside, yeah. So in theory,
So they're cancelling each other out, but does that payment still need to be made?
not necessarily, no. You can just say it's in consideration of £1, or it's in consideration of the surrender and regrant. So you don't necessarily have to put a price into it. You can just say it's no value, nil value, something like that. And generally that would be the case with North Tyneside. With South Tyneside, obviously there's only one lease, so the freeholder will probably want something for that, the person in the other flat. Okay. So the only thing you need to bear in mind is with the statutory lease extension, you have a 2-year requirement, two-year ownership requirement, so you can't extend your lease using a statutory route unless you have first owned it for 2 years. That requirement doesn't apply to voluntary because that's simply by agreement. Other topical issues, cladding, again, this has been talked about quite a bit since Grenfell. Lenders are quite hot on this, where any properties that are over 18 meters high, usually about 5 or 6 stories when that kicks in, need to have an EWS1 certificate, which basically says that the cladding is safe. We've seen plenty of properties that have been unmortgageable as a result of not having the correct documentation. So if you are buying properties in an apartment block, doesn't really apply so much to Newcastle because there's only 2 or 3 big blocks, but be aware of this requirement. EPC has been mentioned. I'm not sure why that says 2030. It should be 2025. Do apologize. But EPC rating of C has been proposed. So effectively, there's an imminent cost coming up where you will have to upgrade your properties to be able to let them. It's a big jump going from E to C, and it's not just a case of changing a few light bulbs. It might be a lot more work that's needed. So you might want to start planning for those costs now and start negotiating that if you're buying properties now, build that into your offer, because you've got that cost coming up very soon if it's an E-rated property or less than C. And the final big one is levelling up for landlords, which as we all know, Michael Gove talked about the levelling up white paper, which affirms the government's position that it plans to abolish Section 21s in the near future as part of the Renters Reform Bill. Now, what's being proposed is that tenancy law will be reformed so that Section 21 is abolished altogether. You can't take possession under Section 21, but they are going to increase the number of grounds that are available under Section 8. So, if, for example, landlord wants to sell a property, that might be one of the grounds. Again, it's all talk. It's simply proposals that haven't become law yet. But there's also talk about introducing a new lifetime deposit, so the tenant not having to pay a deposit each time or something on those lines, and also requiring private landlords to belong to a redress scheme, which currently only really applies to letting agents but not to private landlords, but that's something that they're talking about within this Renters Reform Bill. All talk at the minute, but watch this space, so we'll know more when we get some more news. Any questions? No? Great. Thank you very much.